So now let's take a look at how the comma can also be a helpful sideman for some stylistic choices. The rule number 5, as an exception to the rules, you can actually use a comma with the word but if you're trying to show a contrast and really emphasize that contrast. I'm not a fan of this rule, but you're allowed to do it. So as a stylistic choice, you can actually do a comma but in order to kind of show that there is a pair, but you want to really stress the second half of the pair as opposed to the front half of the pair. So you can do the same thing with the word yet, where yet kind of shows a contrast, but for whatever reason in English, you can have a comma but you can't use a comma yet when you're doing a pair of like words or phrases. You can always use a comma yet for a compound sentence. So if I said the song Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds has been a highly analyzed but ultimately innocuous song about a drawing by John's son Julian about an ailing classmate. Well, I'm actually kind of using this word but to join these two modifiers. I'm saying that the song was highly analyzed, but it was also ultimately innocuous, meaning it was kind of harmless, but everyone kept thinking that it was a really sort of cryptic song. So I want to use that word but as a way of joining them together. And the thing is, the word but is fine by itself. You don't need to add anything at all. But some people are like, well, could I put a comma with the word but to kind of show the contrast? You could. Not a big deal. Another exception. So you may also use a comma with the word and when you're making a pair to kind of show an equal emphasis. So as we learned in rule number 1 that we don't use a comma when we're actually making pairs, you can with the word and if you really want to show that they're not really equally important. So if you have a pair, maybe two verbs, two nouns, two adjectives, and you want to stress the second one more than the first one, put a comma with that word and. So we're going to find this is similar to a dash and as we take on dashes next. An example of what I mean. If I say fans could not get enough of the boys from Liverpool and their merchandise. Well, the word and kind of joins both items, boys and merchandise. And that's fine as it is. You don't need to do anything at all. But if you really wanted to actually show that the merchandise was a little bit more surprising than just simply the boys, like they couldn't get enough of the boys and their merchandise. If you really want to have the reader stress the word and merchandise, well, you are allowed to put a comma in here. If you really want to stress merchandise, fans could not get enough of the boys from Liverpool and their merchandise. Another example of the same thing. Beatlemania saw girls swooning over the boys' music and over the boys' looks. But what if you want to read it as Beatlemania saw girls swooning over the boys' music and over the boys' looks? If you really want to stress that back half more, well, you don't need to put a comma in. But if you really want to stress that back half more than the front half, you want to emphasize how their dreamy looks created more of a mania than their actual music did, put a comma with that and. Rule number 7, we use a pair of commas to encapsulate a parenthetical expression. So think of commas are a way of sort of setting a word or a phrase aside as being an interrupter to the sentence. So the idea that it's sort of, or we have one, we need the other one. They come in pairs. So we're sort of opening parentheses and then closing the parentheses. The only exception, this is the only time where you might put commas on either side of a conjunctive adverb, where you might have a comma in front of the word however, because you have a comma after the word however, because you're kind of making it as an interrupter. It's more of an interrupter, it's not a transition. Let me show you what I mean by this parenthetical expression. If I said Paul McCartney's fondness for singing in made-up French at parties, to pick up girls, by the way, was the inspiration for the French lyrics in the song Michelle. Well, I kind of threw in this little phrase, by the way. And if you notice, by the way, it's not really necessary, it kind of interrupts the flow of the sentence. So what I can do is put commas around it to kind of say, hey, I'm just sort of separating it from the rest of the sentence to kind of give myself a little bit of style and voice. So commas on either side of that little sort of transition right, or that sort of interrupter in the middle of that sentence. Another one said, although his contributions were often overshadowed by John and Paul, as the group evolved, George emerged as quite a talented songwriter, for example, with songs like Something and While My Guitar Gently Weeps. Well, I want you to see that for example seems to interrupt the sentence, and it's not really necessary. But I also want you to see that the phrase like something and while my guitar gently weeps is not unnecessary. It actually is really essential to explain which songs you're referring to. So I want you to realize the difference between those two. That, for example, takes commas because it's not really necessary, but the other one is not an interrupter. He shouldn't take commas. So commas around, for example, but not commas separating songs from that prep phrase. And lastly, we use a pair of commas to encapsulate a contrasting expression or a negative expression. Once again, a pair of commas. So, like other interrupters, a contrasting or a negative expression should be separated with a pair of commas. So, we oftentimes forget the second comma, and I don't want you to. I want you to remember both commas. All right. And so, negative positives like it's this, not that. Once again, commas on both sides of those kind of expressions. So if I said a radio announcer for the BBC reported that Ringo had his toenails, not his tonsils, removed. Well, here's my negative expression, not his tonsils. So I want to put commas on either side of that. And now the main sentence still reads that Ringo had his toenails removed, but now I've separated not his tonsils. Last example. The Day Tripper We Can Work It Out single was released with a double A side instead of a side B after John and Paul could not agree which song deserved top billing. Well, I have this phrase instead of a side B. So here, a double side A is being defined by what it's not. And so therefore, I'm using its negative expression. What's a double side A album? It's an album that has two A's. It doesn't have an A and a B side. So therefore, I'm kind of using this as a contrasting expression. And for that reason, let's put commas on both sides. So the comma, our favorite coupler and our helpful sideman, hopefully we'll still use him as our favorite coupler, but now we're also aware that he has a number of stylistic choices we can use with him. I hope you start using some of those back half rules in your writings. And just be careful though, because sometimes if we overextend any of the punctuation marks, sometimes that just oversaturates. So just be careful of overusing your punctuation marks, but we're going to certainly start using them correctly. Oh, look how happy they are. Hi, girls. All right, so there they are. We're going to finish up by looking at dashes next.